Welcome to another lecture of Psychology 101. I'm your instructor, Dr. Shadi Bishai. In today's lecture, we will be discussing the roots of psychology as a psychological science. But before we dive in, I want you to take a minute to ponder the following quote by Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan is a famous cosmologist, and he co-developed and hosted the original series called Cosmos, which is actually now available on Netflix and hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson. The quote by Sagan is really highlighting that truth does not necessarily have to be comforting. In fact, many truths are uncomfortable. We will be learning about many of these uncomfortable truths about human nature later on in the course. The quote is also highlighting that many things that we find very comfortable, almost intuitive, are actually blatantly false. And I'll give you the following as an example. So these are popular psychology notions that are available in, or at least ubiquitous in pop culture. For example, that we only use 10% of our brains, or that opposites attract. If you haven't already figured it out, all of these are false. They're comfortable ideas that have become popularized, but they don't necessarily have much evidence to support them. So they're comfortable, but they're simply not true. So the business of uncomfortable truths and comfortable nonsense highlights the limitation of our common sense or gut intuitions. Don't get me wrong, a lot of the time, our gut feelings and common sense intuitions are actually very true and lead us to make very appropriate decisions. That is, common sense and intuition have an evolutionary purpose. That is, they developed to solve a particular problem in the world that we're in. And that purpose, or that particular function, is that they help us to make decisions really, really fast, so that we're not spending a lot of time of our thinking and cognitive resources on solving issues that we've already solved before. So there's lots of research now showing, for example, that we are riddled with all kinds of biases that lead us astray. So that is, our brain sacrifices efficiency sometimes for accuracy. So because they're efficient and fast decisions, they can often be very wrong. And again, the research is really supporting this idea that sometimes our gut intuitions, even though they're helpful, even though they've developed to solve a particular issue, they lead us sometimes to make inappropriate decisions, especially if the decision requires more elaborated or effortful types of thinking. And let me show you an example. I want you to pause my video here and click the embedded video that is available in the slideshow that's now available on your courses. And the idea behind the video here that you will watch, the YouTube video, is that your job is to count how many passes the team in white makes. As the video might demonstrate, sometimes our common sense can actually lead us astray, especially if we're not looking in the right places. So what exactly is psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of the mind, the brain, and behavior. In other words, it is the scientific discipline concerned with understanding why and how people do the things that they do, why and how people think the things that they do, and the way in which they think, or why and how they feel or emote. Human psychology has many sub-disciplines within it, And so psychology can be understood from many different levels of analyses. I'll give you an example of what that might look like. So we can look at people's beliefs, for example. We can look at their actions or their behaviors. We can look at their emotions. Or we can look at all these things through different lenses. So we can look at it from the level of the brain or genetics. Or we can examine these things, for example, at the level of society or the level of social influences. Or at the level of cognition or the brain itself. One thing to remember, though, is that focusing on any one level of analysis, so for example, focusing disproportionately on brain and genetic influences and forgetting social or societal influences as just an example, often can lead us to make wrong conclusions about human behavior or incomplete conclusions about human behavior. So I keep talking about psychology as a science. What is science exactly? Science comes from the Latin word for scientia, and this is directly translated as, quote, knowledge. So science is an enterprise concerned with understanding the nature of the natural world as well as the social world in which we're finding ourselves in. This understanding could be for the sake of just understanding, but oftentimes our understanding of the natural and the social world actually leads us to apply our knowledge in a way that actually betters our lives and the lives of others. So at its core, psychology has goals that are related, or at least very much aligned with the goals of science generally, including goals such as observing, describing, analyzing, explaining, and predicting human behavior. And these goals, like I was mentioning earlier, map onto the goals of science in all disciplines generally. We want to observe, we want to understand, we want to predict, as well as we want to control sometimes, especially if we're trying to solve a problem in the world, all natural phenomena. So psychology is a unique discipline, though. So even though it sits firmly within science as a discipline, it has some unique or interesting challenges that it faces as a field. Basically, in that, psychology deals with human beings, and people are much more complicated than particles or chemicals, or let's say we're looking at chemicals in chemistry, or particles or waves in physics. Again, not to reduce these problems as simple, but studying humanity is a much more complex and a much more challenging field for that reason. For instance, take for example the relationship between human intelligence, as measured by IQ tests, for example, and academic performance or vocational or work-related success. Most studies that I know of in psychology suggest that IQ predicts and is correlated with academic and vocational performance. But the prediction of the relationship is not a perfect one. That is, whether or not someone is successful in school or at work is not just due to their intellect or IQ, because there are a number of other variables that are also very important in predicting future success. And I'll give you an example, just a couple here, such as emotional stability, emotional intelligence, right, which is different from intellect or cognitive ability. There's also personality, things like conscientiousness, etc. That is, what I'm trying to say is, human behavior is multiply determined. In other words, more than just one factor goes into explaining and predicting one outcome, for example, academic success or success at work. Take, for example, developing a diagnosis of depression. We know that genes are complicated, but not just genes go into, we know, for example, that depression is quite complicated, but we also understand that depression is not just due to genes, it's also due to people's personality. It's also due to people's mindsets or their cognitions or how they filter or interpret the world around them. It's also due to stressful life events. So to make matters even more complicated, sometimes these particular factors that I talked about, so childhood experiences, social context, poverty, these things are actually not mutually exclusive. Meaning you can actually separate the effects of one factor or another in determining something like depression. That is, there are multiple factors and multiple influences that go and make up something like depression. There are other challenges, including the fact that every person that's even hearing this audio recording right now is extremely different from one another. Meaning that even if I have a very, very accurate prediction or picture of human behavior, it simply cannot predict every individual's behavior because there are just massive, massive individual differences between us all. So one theory really does not and cannot apply to all people. Second, we influence each other's behavior. That is, it's a concept called reciprocal determinism. We acknowledge that other people's behavior doesn't really appear in a vacuum. And I'll give you an example. If you're around people that are more outgoing, for example, chances are you'll start acting more outgoing when you're around them. So it's a very, at least this is what I'm trying to paint for you. It's a very, very dynamic picture of what causes people to behave the way they do, to think the way they do, etc. And of course, there are influences such as the influence of culture on behavior, again, which makes psychology a particularly rich and challenging field. So the influences of culture are ubiquitous, okay? So culture dictates which behaviors are deemed appropriate, quote unquote, which are not deemed appropriate. In fact, depending on the culture you find yourself in, there are many even psychological conditions or psychological disorders that appear very differently from how we understood them in the West. And I'll give you one example here, or actually I'll give you several. The first example is of a condition called Taijin Kuofusho. And it's basically a variant on what we consider here, or what we call here at least, social anxiety. In Western psychology, social anxiety is typified by fear of embarrassing yourself or making a fool out of yourself in social contexts. In East Asian context, this variant of social anxiety called Taijin Kuofusho looks about the same, but a little bit different. In that, actually, people with Taijin Kuofusho are afraid to make other people feel uncomfortable as opposed to afraid of embarrassing themselves. Okay? So the object of the fear is not making a fool of oneself, but embarrassing someone else in public. And there's now lots of research that shows that culture has influences on things like human thought, emotion, behavior. So it's a very, very powerful factor in determining people's behaviors. And I'll give you another example here. There is a very famous study that was conducted in 2008 by Masuda et al. They're actually researchers from Waterloo University. So in this study, the researchers showed a group of white European students and a group of East Asian students a picture of someone's face showing a kind of an emotion. And the person, that's the focal point of that picture, is surrounded by other people. And then the researchers asked all of these participants to make a judgment about the emotion shown by the central person in the photo. In making a judgment about an emotion that the person who is focal to the picture is displaying, white students of European background look at that person's face to determine their emotional expression. By contrast, students of East Asian backgrounds, what they did to figure out the central person's emotion was to look at the surrounding faces to make a judgment about the emotional content of the face of the person in the middle. So, in talking about cultural influences, there's also something important that I need to mention. There are generally two ways to study the influence of culture on human behavior. First, researchers can adopt the approach similar to the approach described in the Masuda et al. Study that I just talked about. And this approach is called the cross-cultural or the ethic approach, and is interested in comparing and contrasting more than one culture on a particular variable or idea of interest. Again, very, very much similar to the Masuda et al. Study that I just described. There is a second approach, though, in looking at cultural influences over human behavior. And this second approach is called the ethnographic or the emic approach. And in this approach, researchers are less concerned with comparing and contrasting more than one culture. Instead, they focus on concepts or ideas that emerge from within that culture. Okay, so the interest here is less about studying concepts, comparing and contrasting different cultures, but looking at a particular cultural concept from within that same culture. So I've been painting a pretty bleak picture of common sense and intuition. So should we trust our common sense and intuitions at all then? Don't get me wrong. Common sense intuition, as I mentioned, is helpful in many instances. And I'll give you one example of that. For example, researchers tells us that your first impressions or gut feelings about the trustworthiness of the people you first meet is actually pretty accurate. There are other things that common sense gets right. For example, employees who describe themselves as happy, as you can probably imagine, also happen to be more productive than other employees who describe themselves as unhappy. But with that all said, common sense is often very wrong. So we have to subject our intuitions, our common sense ideas, to the rigors of science and the scientific method. Psychology is a very rich, very complex field. So we have to rely on appropriate and vetted ways to understand human nature. How do you do that? Well, we can rely on our observations of the world. Our senses, basically, to rely on the basic sense organs to try and understand the world in which we live. Kind of like this motto that I have up here, which is it's a motto of naive realism, which is I'll believe it when I see it. And that's definitely a step up from relying on our gut feelings or common sense intuitions in terms of reliability, but it's still not enough, because even sometimes our senses and our observations can lead us astray. They can fail us. The picture in this slide is a representation of that. So the woman on the left is actually, in reality, quite considerably taller than the girl on the right. However, the Ames rule is a particular room that is specifically designed or created to give you this visual illusion. That is, sometimes our observations of the world are inaccurate. They can lead us astray. John Locke, who's pictured on the right here, is credited to being the father of empiricism. And empiricism is one of the building blocks of science. John Locke talked about how we need to vet our ideas through this lens of empiricism. And empiricism really is that our observations have to adhere to rigorous standards in order for us to start believing them. So science is really not about the content, but it's about an approach to understanding the world around us. It's a set of ideas and a set of skills that we use to apply to our observations. Theories, and I'm sure you've heard that word before, colloquially, theories are very much central to science, but they're often misunderstood by the public, unfortunately. For example, a theory is not an unproven guess, as many people believe. It's a package or a network of predictions about a number of findings in the natural or social world. Okay, so that's just to clear that one up. The reality is, we really do need science because people are just riddled with biases, and biases are defined as systematic ways in which we distort information around us. The mother of all cognitive biases is a bias called the confirmation bias. And the confirmation bias is defined as our tendency to look almost exclusively at evidence that confirms our initial beliefs about the world or about people, and ignore all other evidence that suggests that our initial beliefs are actually wrong. If you don't believe how common this particular bias is, what I'm going to invite you to do is pause this video and click on the link in your slides. And the link will lead you to an interactive YouTube video where you're asked a riddle called the Wason selection task. And you're asked to solve this riddle depending on your ability to suppress or be aware of your confirmation bias. So I do challenge you to stop the video and try the interactive YouTube video out. Another really common cognitive bias is one that is called belief perseverance. And this is people's tendency to stick with their intuitions or their beliefs even when they're bombarded with information or evidence that contradicts these initial beliefs. So I began this lecture by explaining to you that sometimes uncomfortable ideas are right, and sometimes comfortable ideas are wrong. This is why we need to very carefully subject our beliefs about the world and about human nature to the rigors of science. Given our many biases, we need a system like science to guard us from information that is blatantly incorrect, or people or companies that, for example, try to exploit these biases. We call claims that sound scientific without actually being scientific pseudoscience. And we call it pseudoscience because it does not meet the safeguards or the rigors that science has put in place to protect us against our own biases. Here are common signs of pseudoscience, and you'll see these on the right-hand side here. For example, exaggerated claims such as, this supplement, I've been taking this supplement and the supplement can make you lose 15 pounds in a week. Things like reliance on anecdote, which are personal stories. And I'll give you an example. So, so and so, Susie and Sally, they tried this pill and it really helped them out. Or, for example, lacking peer review or any kind of connection to other bodies of work in science. Or in science, this idea of peer review is extremely important. Any idea that is released to the scientific community as well as the public must be vetted through a wall of experts, if you will. Here are again multiple statements that may colloquially sound scientific, for example. But are they? I encourage you to stop the video to watch the embedded YouTube clip that I have here. Again, which will supplement some of the ideas that I've been talking about. So, why do people cling to pseudoscience? Why do they cling to comfortable ideas that just sound like they're true? Part of why we cling to pseudoscience is because we want to make sense of our world. We're these very elaborate meaning-making machines. We want things to be orderly. We want things to make sense. Take, for example, the concept of epiphania, which is defined as the perception of a connection among completely unrelated objects or things. Okay? Human beings are really prone to find connections or make meaning where none really exist. For example, another concept that is part of the concept of epiphania, so if you want to think about epiphania as this umbrella term, and within that umbrella term, there's another concept which is called pareidolia, or the tendency to see human faces in anything that remotely resembles a human face. And I have two images here on the right-hand side. These two pictures are an illustration of these concepts that I've just been talking about. The first is a photo taken on the surface of Mars, and the photo was taken in the 1970s. And if you look close, there's something there, kind of central top of the photo, that resembles a human face. So much so that the photo was actually dubbed the face of Mars. And it really puzzled scientists for a very long time. And this all ended in the early 2000s when we got a closer look at this lump of what turned out actually to be just a lump of dirt and rocks. And it was just, like I was saying, it was just dirt and rocks that were showing a particular profile of shadows that just resembled a human face. Here are two other examples of this. I'm sure many of you will see human faces. That potato looks adorable. So why do we cling so dearly to pseudoscience and pseudoscientific beliefs? Besides the fact that we want to make meaning, we want to feel like we're in control. We want to feel like our lives have purpose and have meaning. And frankly, we want to outlive our bodies. So what do? We cling to beliefs that just sound good. That, they're comforting. And these comforting beliefs oftentimes are thought of or perceived as outliving ourselves. And once we cling to pseudoscience, we have a very hard time letting go of it. For the very reason that we've already been discussing, which is that we're full of biases, we're full of fallacies. We cling to things given the confirmation bias, the belief perseverance. And our thinking is really not very straight at all. Take, for example, the emotional reasoning fallacy, which is another really common fallacy, which is the tendency to believe something to be true or untrue just because you have an emotion that might suggest it's true or untrue. For example, that's when people who are having a lot of anxiety, they take their physiological signs of anxiety as evidence that something must be wrong. Okay, so that we call that emotional reasoning. So we use our emotions as a guide, whether or not to believe something. Similarly, we sometimes believe in things because lots of other people around us believe in them. And this is a concept called the bandwagon fallacy. Not only do we do all that, but we actually have a very hard time understanding that we ourselves are susceptible to these fallacies and biases. And we think to ourselves that, you know what, other people may fall for it, but not me. And we call this the not me fallacy. So why am I droning on about science and pseudoscience? Why does any of this actually matter? It matters a lot, as it turns out. At the very least, when we put our faces or our focus on pseudoscience and pseudoscientific beliefs, what we're doing is essentially putting our proverbial eggs in a basket that's not worth our time. And in doing so, it's costing us an opportunity to pursue another meaningful or efficacious option or belief that can actually enhance and enrich our lives. So we call this concept opportunity cost. It is literally costing us an opportunity to invest in the wrong thing, that is pseudoscience. The second reason why we should all care is even more sinister and sad. Pseudoscience and pseudoscientific ideas can actually harm people. And I have a picture of a young girl on the right-hand side, and her name is Candace Newmaker, and she suffered from autism. In their desperation, her parents decided to enroll her in a type of therapy at the time called rebirthing therapy. And the idea behind rebirthing therapy is to reenact the rebirthing process. So basically what was done here was that it was believed that the cause of autism was a poor or disrupted bond between the mother and the child around the time of birth. So they try to reenact the rebirthing to try and correct this disruption in the bonding process. So the process of rebirthing, as it was through this therapy, involves grown adults who smother the child with pillows. And tragically, Candace died during one of these rituals. What science helps us do is to be critical, skeptical about the nature of the world and humanity. Essentially, critical thinking allows us to be open-minded about all claims, but really only accept those for which there is sufficient and strong evidence. In this way, critical thinking is really synonymous with scientific thinking. At its core, science rests upon 6 principles that distinguishes it from pseudoscience. In the next lecture, we will begin to examine these 6 principles in a little bit more detail. Until next time.